Okay, we're back in Psalms. We're going to be in Psalm 61. I think we're probably still in Psalms the last time y'all were visiting us. We're going to be there the next time too, probably. Psalm 61. Let's start by just reading through the psalm, beginning with the historical note. So Psalm 61. And to the chief musician upon Neginah, a psalm of David. Hear my cry, O God, attend unto my prayer. From the end of the earth will I cry unto thee. When my heart is overwhelmed, lead me to the rock that is higher than I. For thou hast been a shelter for me, and a strong tower from the enemy. I will abide in thy tabernacle forever. I will trust in the covert of thy wings. Selah. For thou, O God, hast heard my vows. Thou hast given me the heritage of those that fear thy name. Thou wilt prolong the king's life, and his years as many generations. He shall abide before God forever. O prepare mercy and truth, which may preserve him. So I will sing praise unto thy name forever, that I may daily perform my vows. Okay. So this simple Psalm of David is to be played on the Neginah. That's an instrument of strings. That's about as detailed as anyone can get for sure. And that is, it's thought to be a cry during David's exile when he was fleeing from Absalom. And it's briefer and more personal than many of David's psalms, and it's precious in how it displays his close relationship with God in a difficult time. It doesn't describe here a major aspect of his crisis, and it doesn't even focus on a lot of anguish as some of David's psalms do. It more focuses on what has given stability in David's life. And at least that's how it has come off to me. It's briefer and more personal than many of the Psalms, though. And for that, and in that, I think you see that personal relationship that David has with the Lord. And herein David sees God in just the first 4 verses, as he describes him in several different ways, as the rock that is higher than he is. That seems to me the most striking metaphor in the psalm. As his shelter, as a strong tower, and as one under whose wings he finds comfort and protection. David seeks God's leadership. He seeks God's protection, and he seeks God's preservation and his continued blessing in this psalm. And he begins, as so many of the psalms open up, with a plea for God to hear him, right? This is a pretty familiar way to start one of David's psalms. Hear my cry, O God, attend unto my prayer. And then verse 2 says, from the end of the earth will I cry unto thee. When my heart is overwhelmed, lead me to the rock that is higher than I. So if the conclusions of the scholars are correct, that this is during that time period in which David was fleeing from Absalom, and I don't think we have reason to doubt them substantially, then David's cry comes from a place of isolation, definitely from a place of sorrow. It's his son that has given reason for him to flee from the royal city of Jerusalem. And it comes from a place of relative insecurity. And I say relative because David doesn't seem to be insecure in this psalm, which speaks to his relationship with God, where he finds his security there. His security is in God. So the fact that he's been chased out of the city where he was king, and that he's on the lam from and exiled by his own son, that's not enough for him to come off as insecure in the psalm. And that kind of says something about his relationship with God. It kind of makes you think, well, what would it take for me to look insecure, right? What would it take for me for in my communication to seem insecure about what was going to happen next? David here doesn't come off profoundly that way, which means his relationship with God is where he finds his security. And the fact that he's been exiled from his throne in Jerusalem is not enough to overcome that. So I don't know if it's hardly worth mentioning, but it's in my head, so I can't help myself. But there are some commentators that want to attribute nearly all of David's Psalms to the Jews in the Babylonian exile, right? Even though the Psalm themselves, not just in the historical note, which they then just disregard all the historical notes as just being wrong, but it disregards part of the Psalms themselves, as if these in the Babylonian exile are speaking in a Davidic tone and using references that are clearly from David's life just to apply it to themselves, right? And it just seems quite a reach. But I'm in wild disagreement with Adam Clark on this, if you care. You probably don't. But as David often does, along with his cry to be heard, he asks for God also to pay attention. And I don't know how that sounds to you. Hear my cry, O God, attend unto my prayer. As a father, this is something that I remember when my kids were young. They haven't done it to me lately, but Allie used to do this a lot. She did not like it when I wasn't looking at her in the eyeballs when she was talking to me, so she'd put one of her little hands on either side of my face and point my face towards her, so she wasn't going to let me get away with multitasking, and which was probably good, and I probably shouldn't have given her cause to do that. But anyway, that's what I think of when I hear David say, hear my cry, O God, attend unto my prayer, right? He's asking to be heard, but he's also asking for special attention. He's asking for specific focus on what he's saying. And there's not a lot of great depth to this statement that he's making here, or this request that he's making in verse 1, but there is surely some of the common, profundity that we have come to expect from the Shepherd King. And it seems almost a formality. If you're trying to take a lesson from verse 1, it seems almost a formality to enter the throne room of heaven, to ask to be heard, and then to draw focused attention to the prayer that he brings, right? Hear my cry, O God, attend unto my prayer. You can picture David stepping into the throne room of God, asking to be heard, and then kind of announcing that what he's going to be giving is a prayer, and he wants special attention to that prayer, right? But maybe such formalities are important when it causes us to think more deeply about what we would say to this great God of all creation, right? Not all of David's Psalms sound like this. Some of them sound like just a desperate cry in a time of anguish, right? But I think perhaps this is helpful to kind of slow down a little bit, think about entering the throne room of God and framing the coming request to hear my cry, attend unto my prayer. And perhaps this is helpful when we can bring ourselves to such formality. just for the state of heart and mind that it puts us in. And when I say when we can bring ourselves to such formality, let's face it, there are times when formality is off the table and you're just desperately crying out to the Lord, and that's great. But on occasion, I think it does us well to remind ourselves of the throne room into which we've entered. Anyway, so David asks to be heard and for divine attention to be brought to bear. And then he says in verse 2, at the beginning of verse 2, we see that his cry is from his furthest wandering, right? He says, from the end of the earth will I cry unto thee. So as he's entered into the throne room of God and asks for special attention on this prayer that he's bringing to the Lord, he is announcing that he is making this plea from the end of the earth, right? And perhaps the desert place, the cave or the canyon in which David sojourned seemed to him to be the other end of the earth, certainly from where he had come. And home was for David Jerusalem, that place to which God had brought him, that place that God had given him in victory over the Jebusites, right? And that place from which he had been temporarily driven by his own son. So David was not wandering from nowhere, right? It's one thing to find yourself in the ends of the earth if that's what you do, right? You're just wondering. No, this isn't David. He has a home. He has a home. It was a pretty nice setup, if you remember. You know, he had the throne and all that, and he was king over all of Israel, and he's there in Jerusalem. God's given him victory there. God allowed him to bring the tabernacle to Jerusalem. I mean, everything is forward-looking, and this is so clearly God's will for his life, except for this little thing about his son throwing him out of the city, you know. So there seems to be almost a temporary tone to this psalm and how David prays it, which once again comes from that relationship that he has with God that is so secure that not even getting thrown out of the royal city of Jerusalem has shaken him so much that he seems insecure. So David was not wandering from nowhere; he was driven from home, and where we are seems all the more isolated when there's a place that we feel we should rather be. Right? David knew where he was supposed to be. He was supposed to be in Jerusalem. He didn't know how long he was going to be gone, but it seemed like, 1 yard away from Jerusalem was a long ways away from where he ought to be, right? And so he can't understand why he's remaining elsewhere, right? So this is the place from which David cries out to be heard. This is the where. It's from his furthest wanderings. But then we see the when in relationship to David's state of heart and mind. And his heart and mind is overwhelmed. He says, from the end of the earth will I cry unto thee, when my heart is overwhelmed. So David is isolated, distant from home, and now we see he is overwhelmed. That's a word, honestly, what is written here, when my heart is overwhelmed, is much better than the one by which I chose to synonymize it. I put exhausted just so that I wasn't saying overwhelmed again. But it's a word that means being out of control, of being overflowed by the circumstance of life. And that's the situation in which we find David. It's in the heart that this is felt the most, when you are completely overwhelmed by the circumstances. And I speak this partly metaphorically, but also in reality, when you are really overwhelmed in life, like, you feel it right there under your palm, right? Right there. You feel it in your heart. And there's something to that's where you feel a lot of strong emotion. And so I think that's kind of what David is saying here, at least in metaphor, when my heart is overwhelmed. And it's in such a place that we most need to request the specific leadership of God. And so we see how David does this at the end of verse 2. And this is where I'm moving to the primary point of lead me. For the last part of verse 2 all the way through verse 5. And it says, verse 2 says, "From the end of the earth will I cry unto thee when my heart is overwhelmed." And here's where he says, "Lead me to the rock that is higher than I." To me, this last clause of verse 2 stands out the most in the whole psalm. Lead me to the rock that is higher than I. I love a turn of phrase that is powerful, and that one just sounds great. And quite frankly, it takes a while to figure out why it just sounds so good. Lead me to a rock. Lead me to the rock that is higher than I. And again, I think my summary falls short of the actual words of the text. But David says, "Lead me," and I'm going to summarize that last clause in verse 2, "to the place that I cannot get on my own." Right? To the place that I cannot get on my own. David asks for leadership from God to bring him to a sure place, to the rock, right? That's a sure place. He's not looking to be brought to a place where his footing is unstable. He's looking to be brought to a sure place, a place from where he can hide behind the outcropping and be safe, a sure place, and a place that is more than he is. Lead me to the rock that is higher than I, because like where I am is not high enough. And so it's something that is more than he is and something that is beyond his own reach. Lead me to the rock that is higher than I. And perhaps as I try to think of like, how did David get to this place where he brings out this turn of phrase? And I wonder if maybe David had found himself a rocky place to hunker down in the wilderness, a place of relative security. And then he's there in his little hiding place, whatever it may have been, and he's meditating on how he misses. And I think this is interesting, because you might think he's missing sitting on the throne and maybe getting the grapes fed to him or something. You know, that's not really what he's thinking about. As you read the rest of the psalm, it seems like he's missing the walking to the tabernacle and worshiping the Lord there. And he's thinking of how God is not limited to that place, right? He's sitting there thinking, man, this is about the time of the evening that I'd be walking to the tabernacle to worship the Lord. And I'm missing that. But you know, it's not like God is bound to that place. That's just where we formally go and worship him. And I can't go there right now, but I'll bet right now where I am, God can lead me to a sure place that I cannot get on my own, that I can have this experience with him and this fellowship with him right here, right now. That's right. And so as he meditates on this, then perhaps David muses that God could meet with him out here in this far place, in this little outcropping of rock. It's really nothing in comparison to the safety and the protection that God could provide. As a matter of fact, you might even say that a low place exposed to all attackers is still higher than him if God were to lead him there, right? So God was his rock. And any place to which God leads is higher than where we can get on our own. So this is the rock. Indeed, God is the one who leads him to this place, and God is the rock to which the Lord leads him, right? I think sometimes we look at our circumstances, we do want God to lead us, and we want him to lead us into circumstances that are better. What we should be asking, perhaps, is for God to lead us closer to him. It doesn't matter where that is. It will be the rock that is higher than you if God leads you there. So God is the rock that is higher than us. to which we must be led and helped by him. So David's reason for thinking in this way is that he's learned what it meant to have God as his shelter. And he says, lead me not only to the place that I cannot get on my own, but in verse 3, the opening clause, we see that he says, lead me because you have been my shelter. And this is where we begin to see why David, he's admitted to being overwhelmed. He's admitted to being isolated and in a far place. But the reason he doesn't sound in a complete panic is because God has been his shelter in the past. And so he has this experience in his relationship with God that he's already found God to be his shelter. For thou hast been a shelter for me. So he asks God to lead him because God has been his shelter. You see that, how that clearly states in verse 3, the first clause, it clearly states that as a reason for God leading him to the rock that is higher than I, right? Lead me to the rock that is higher than I, for thou hast been a shelter for me. That's the sentence. And it may be that from the enemy is the object of both predicates, right? So look at verse 3 again. For thou hast been a shelter for me and a strong tower from the enemy. So you might say, thou hast been a shelter for me from the enemy. You also might say, thou hast been a strong tower for me from the enemy, right? You see how that object, just grammatically speaking, how that object could apply to either predicate. But it may be that the object from the enemy really only applies to the last predicate and not the first. But the meaning is not substantially changed by either understanding, I don't think. Whether it's a shelter in general from the storm or cold or heat, right? Turns out we need that. Or if it's a shelter from the onslaught of the enemy, it still speaks of a place that provides comfort and a life-saving shield from the untenable surroundings and circumstances. Shelter it's one of the primary needs of mankind, right? You got to have shelter. And man wasn't made to live in the elements. He was made to live in shelter. It's one of life's most urgent necessities. If you find yourself isolated out in the boonies, one of the first things you need to find is shelter, right? And we would do well to find the Lord to be our shelter. That shelter, that need for shelter, by the way, it's exasperated and magnified when the enemy is expending his or her efforts to defeat you. So you need the shelter just because you were made to be in shelter. You need the shelter even more if you don't have it from the normal surroundings, but you also don't have it from an enemy that's trying to make your life miserable, right? And so we would do well to find the Lord to be our shelter so that we are familiar with what he offers when the enemy comes against us. So we may say, lead me because you have been my fortress. And that's the second part of verse 3. He says, for thou hast been a shelter for me and a strong tower from the enemy. Now, this most definitely is the predicate for from the enemy. Strong tower, God being his strong tower, is his strong tower from the enemy. So this definitely has the idea of from the enemy as being the object. And the strong tower, that Hebrew word, it may sound familiar to you as migdal. Sometimes in movies when they make when they try to make a tower sound fearsome or strong, they'll put some variant of this word in as the name of the tower. I think J.R. Tolkien did it. So little geeky tidbit, no extra charge for that. The strong tower is Migdal. It speaks of a fortress that can be defended. And that offers protection from the attacks of the enemy. And what David is saying is that God was that for him, right? And David knew something of this place of power. He knew it from when he ran from Saul. And Saul was after him, and he was kind of a nobody, except that he'd slain Goliath, and then he started killing some Philistines and getting some fame. But the king was after him. The entire the army of the king was after him, and so he knew something of a place of power. he know he know he knew what it was like to find a place where even Saul couldn't get him, and realized that God was this place of power for him, and he knew it from when he was on the throne too. He knew what it was like to be in a place of power, and that's what a strong tower is. And now he knows it in his most dire straits as he flees from Absalom, when God is the only fortress in which he still trusts. And we don't know where he was hiding at this time, but I'll tell you what he was in. He was in a fortress because God was his fortress from his enemy. Next, if the idea is accurate that David is exiled from Jerusalem, this is his promise to spend even more time in the tabernacle worshiping God if and when he returns to the throne. This is where we begin to get the idea that he is really missing being back in Jerusalem when he can go and worship in the evening in the tabernacle. He says, I've summarized this verse 4, the first clause in verse 4 is, I will never leave your fellowship. He says, I will abide in thy tabernacle forever. I will trust in the covert of thy wings, Selah. If commitments are to be made regarding your life after God's deliverance, right? Have you ever done that? Have you ever said, God, if you will do this and just help me out in this situation, I will do this, right? I remember as a kid promising God, I'm trying to remember what I promised him I would do. I remembered at the time, I think I promised him I would read through the Bible, which I was doing anyway. So if he'd help me out on a test. And I was just like, 13 or something. And, Abraham did it, so I figured I'd make a deal. And I don't remember if it worked or not. Probably studying would have helped too. But if you're making a deal with God and you're making promises, if commitments are to be made regarding your life after God's deliverance, right? If you'll do this, God, if you'll deliver me, then a commitment to spend more time in his presence, definitely appropriate, right? I mean, that's one you can keep. You know you can. Say, God, I will abide in thy tabernacle forever. Now, forever is a long time. So, but this missing his time in the presence of God at the tabernacle seems to drive David's whole purpose in writing this psalm. It's a real centerpiece in the psalm. And he's determined to take advantage of his proximity to the house of the Lord when he returns. He's just missing being in the tabernacle. And he says, God, when I get back, you bring me back, and that's going to happen because you promised me I was going to be there and that my kids were going to be there and that I was going to have lineage there. So I know I'm coming back, but it's not too good for me right now. But I will abide in thy tabernacle forever. Next, we see the second part of verse 4, so 4b, is I will trust in your covering. I will abide in thy tabernacle forever. I will trust in the covert of thy wings, Selah. So this second part of this verse, of verse 4, it likens God to a mother hen in the sense of that familiar picture. And I say mother hen, trust me, it is with some trepidation that I say it that way. But mother hen is the picture in our mind. It's the most used metaphor, if you will, of a mother hen in the sense of that familiar picture of the protecting covering of the little chicks with its wings, right? And since it is here as a metaphor of God, maybe we would more like to want a picture of a great majestic eagle, all right, if that helps you, fiercely guarding against the pesky ravens or other predatory vermin, right? And maybe you've seen the video of where is it? Big Bear Lake or something like that down in San Bernardino. There's this live streaming of an eagle nest, and there's an eagle there, and when it's sitting on some eggs right now, and Oh, they already hatched? All right, well, see, I haven't watched it lately, but I have seen those eagles defend against ravens, right? And it's kind of cool to watch because this fierce eagle is just batting its wings and protecting its eaglets, right? Where was I? Anyway, that's the metaphor that I'd rather have in my head, I think. But there is no feathered creature, hen or eagle, that can provide the comfort and the protection that God brings to those who will trust in the covert of his wings. And there's no fierceness with which an animal in God's creation protects its young, like when God has taken it on as his responsibility to protect you as you have run to the cover of his wings. When we saw the first two reasons David gave for God leading him, as God had been his shelter and his fortress, right? Those are the 2 points that start with because. Now there's two more given in verse 5, and it is because you have heard my promises at the beginning of verse 5. He says, "For thou, O God, hast heard my vows." David had made vows that were in the interest of God that David keep. Think about that for a minute. If you're going to make promises to God, make promises that you know God wants you to keep, right? Not just things that you want to do, but promises that you know God has a vested interest in you keeping. Something that God wants you to do if you're going to make a promise to God. And so David had made vows that were in the interest of God that David keep. He says, and this is the reason here, the argument that he makes that God should lead him, right? Lead me because you have heard my promises. Thou hast heard my vows. You heard me when I made these vows, Lord. So David argues here that God should lead him so that he can fulfill those vows. Have you made believable promises to God? I think believable is pretty good because there's a whole lot of things you'll say in a desperate pinch, right? But God's not fooled, right? You hear people make desperate promises to people all the time when they're in a pinch. And you're like, oh yeah, you ain't doing that, right? Don't make those kind of promises to God because he sees through unbelievable promises, right? Make believable ones, right? and plan on keeping them because you're in big trouble if you don't. But thou hast heard my vows. I ask you this, have you made believable promises to God that you might use an argument for his intervention in your life and in his leadership and guidance into better situations? You want him to lead you in life? Make a promise to God that is absolutely believable, and that means that you definitely will keep that promise, and that God has led you to make that promise. So then it is in his interest that you keep that promise, and God will lead you. Could you say this? God, you've heard the promise. You've heard my promises to you. And you know my will and my intentions to keep them. Now lead me so that I can keep those promises. Right? David gives his fourth reason for God to lead him in the second part of verse 5. He says, because you have blessed my family. Just look at how he says this. He says, for thou, O God, hast heard my vows. Thou hast given me the heritage of those that fear thy name. Now, there's 3 or 4 different ideas about what David might be talking about here. Thou hast given me the heritage of those that fear thy name. And this is his argument for why God needs to lead him. David may here be speaking of the godly family into which he was raised. Into which he was born and by which he was raised, right? That would be, thou hast given me the heritage. That would be heritage, family heritage in the past, right? of those that fear thy name. He may be saying, God, I grew up in a family that loved you, and I know that you've chosen me to serve you and honor the heritage of the family that raised me, and let me do this for you, right? That may be the argument he's making. But he also may be talking about the heritage that is to come, because as it turns out, God had promised David that his son would sit on the throne, and he knew that this was going to be Solomon, right? And so then he might be talking about the godly son who would eventually succeed him, not Absalom, right? Or he might be talking about just the promises that God had made, that David's lineage would be blessed because of him. Then there is the possibility, and quite frankly, that most of the commentators would agree on this, that he's talking about the coming Messiah from the Davidic line. Whatever the case may be, David is setting forward the fact that God has blessed his family, whether it be the family of his past, the family briefly coming up, or just the blessings that God has promised in general to the Davidic line, or the fact that the Messiah is coming from the Davidic line. David is saying, look, you're the one that looked at my family and said, I'm blessing that family. Well, Lord, here I am. This is in your interest. He's seeing God's plan laid out in front of him, and he sees his family as a part of it, and he realizes that there's no sense of being disconnected from your family, right? In the eyes of God and in reputation and everything else. And David's family had, both in his past, a heritage of those that fear his name. In the future, the promise that God would bless with a heritage that feared his name. And he says, God, I see that you've made me a part of this. So lead me, because that clearly fits your plan for my family, right? I think that's good to think that way. Regardless, these blessings from God, they are arguments for God's intervention to lead him, making good on his investments, if you will. God making good on his investments into David's family. We come now to the last section of the Psalm, verses 6 through 8, in which David speaks of his own preservation. And we'll just read verses 6 through 8. I've titled this, Preserve Me. Thou wilt prolong the king's life and his years as many generations. He shall abide before God forever. O prepare mercy and truth, which may preserve him. So will I sing praise unto thy name forever, that I may daily perform my vows. I suppose it's possible that David just asserts this hope, right? Thou wilt prolong the king's life. And he just thought, you know what? God's going to make me live a long time. I mean, I suppose that's possible. But it seems more, though, of a promise that David is referencing here. Else, why would he be so confident in it, right? And so it seems more of a promise that David is referencing. And you know, many of the promises toward David and towards the nation of Israel may inure to this end, that God would bless with longevity in the throne a king that honors the Lord. I think that in principle we can take that as a promise from God. So I've just stated this reason for preservation. He says, God, preserve me as you have promised. And that's kind of the point that I think he's making. Thou wilt prolong the king's life and his years as many generations. Promises are also made of Messiah from the Davidic line that sound substantially like this, as his years as many generations. Regardless, again, David confidently states that it is so. Thou wilt prolong the king's life and his years as many generations. And I think we can apply this in principle, because God will indeed preserve the faithful as it inures to his glory, right? And that's what we should be looking at, is how is God going to be glorified in my preservation? If you can see that, pray for it, right? Pray for God to preserve you, to give you a long life, to serve him. And because after all, everything is for his glory that God does. So I think we may confidently say that our preservation is in his hands, and certain promises that we do have regarding the preservation of our soul's salvation and of that which we do for his glory. You recognize God has promised that those who are in the Lord's hand will cannot be taken out of his hand, right? That I will never leave thee nor forsake thee. There's so many promises of an eternal security for those who've taken Jesus Christ as their Savior. That's a promise of preservation. You may claim that, right? Because you know he's going to keep that promise, and he is glorified when you call him on his promises, right? Because it means that you trust him. Next, in verse 7, we see how David speaks again in a nod to his time in the presence of God at the tabernacle, arguing for his own preservation with this reason, so that I may be with thee. First clause of verse 7. He shall abide before God forever. Now, he's continuing and referencing himself in the third person, if you haven't figured that out, right? He started talking about the king. Well, he's the king, so that he's the king that he's talking about. And so he's referencing himself in the third person, and he asks for this preservation so that he may be with the Lord, worshiping him again in the tabernacle. And if there's an argument for preservation, it is so that we might glorify him in this place where he's provided for our public worship of him. And we should pray for God to give us opportunity to do that, to be a part of his church, to be a part of the congregation that glorifies him in a public place. And then second part of verse 7, we see next exactly how David expects God to provide this preservation for which he pleads. And it is by mercy and truth. All right, verse 7, he shall abide before God forever, speaking of himself. Oh, prepare mercy and truth, which may preserve him. That's how he sees God providing the preservation for which he is asking. Mercy is that loving grace of God that spares the daily judgments that might rightfully come against even the most pious and devoted servant of God, right? My little almost smart aleck remark whenever someone says, how are you doing? And I say, better than I deserve, right? That it comes as just a habit now. And but it's a real thing, because who didn't deserve to be struck dead by God today, right? I mean, any sin, unless you've been perfect all day, in which case, good for you. And because the wages of sin is death, right? So it's by his mercy that we are preserved every moment. And so mercy is that loving grace of God, sparing the daily judgments that might rightfully come against even the most pious and devoted servants of God. Truth is the reality of the justifying grace of God and the unfailing promises of God. When he asks for mercy and truth, when you ask God for mercy, you're not asking him to forego justice. God doesn't forego justice. He took all the justice on the cross. The justice is done. So it's mercy and truth. David's not asking to be preserved by an unjust exception to the grace of God, but merely in the keeping of it. So might we claim the eternal security that he has promised to the believer. I'm not eternally secure in my relationship with God because of how good I have become. I'm eternally secure in my relationship with God because God has granted me mercy because Jesus took my justice. That's right. And so that is the truth. Mercy and truth is how we are preserved every day. So finally, we come to verse 8. And here I think we see two more arguments for his preservation. Number one is so that I may praise thee. He says, so will I sing praise unto thy name forever. This argument for preservation is one that's used for receiving the deliverance and the blessings of God repeatedly in the Psalms. David is constantly saying, help me or deliver me. Sometimes even in his most desperate moments when you could hear the desperate tone in his voice almost, he says, Do this, Lord, so that I can continue to live and praise you, because this is what you made me to do, right? And so it is so that David may find more time and reason to praise the Lord. This argues more than just that David promises to praise the Lord if he is preserved, right? But rather that he has found his purpose on earth as singing praises to the Lord. And he kind of thinks that what God has made him to do is important. Boy, hey, when you find what God has made you to do, it's not prideful to think that's important. He's the one that decided to pick you to do what it is he has made you to do. When you find that, grab a hold of it and realize this is what he made me for. So this is important, not just to me, it's important to him. So now I may use that as an argument in my prayer to remember, God, you made me for this. So help me, lead me, deliver me, preserve me, so that I may do what you have called me to do. And for David, he's constantly saying that God had made him to sing praises to his name. And he expects his preservation would only extend that purpose. Finally, we come to an argument that David made in similar fashion about why God should lead him. And he says that in the very last clause of the psalm, he says, so I will sing praise unto thy name forever, that I may daily perform my vows. This gets right down to the nuts and bolts of how David plans to live out every last day of his life. And here it seems to be more of a daily keeping of promises, right? Remember, he's already pointed this out once, this idea of, God, you heard the vows that I've made. I can only keep those vows if I'm alive. So, lead me, right? I need your leadership so that I can do those, so I can keep those vows. I need your leadership. That was his argument for getting God's leadership. Now he's making the argument for his preservation. And he says, Lord, preserve me so that every day I can get up and I can do in my life what I've promised you that I would do. And that's a good way to think about how to live a godly life. Usually we think about this a lot of times during a funeral. And you see someone's long life and the testimony of that life and how they lived, however they lived, right? And that's when you a lot of times think about, well, what will the testimony of my life be at the end when everyone is standing around talking about it? Will it be the testimony of a godly life? And if that's the overwhelming testimony of your life after you've faded off the scene, man, what a great thing that would be, right? So how do I get there? How do I have the testimony of a godly life? One day at a time. That's how. One day at a time. You don't just wait until it's easier and start, I'm going to live a godly life. I just got to get past this hump here, right? No, you know what? You wake up in the morning and you put God first. You make promises about how you're going to start your day that are in your relationship with him. And you fulfill that promise one day at a time, that I may daily perform my vows. David here is asking for God to hear him. He's asking for God to lead him. He's asking for God to preserve him. And why? So that I can get back on the throne and be the king. No. So that I can get up tomorrow morning and I can do what I've promised you I would do in my life. And then so that I can go to bed at night after having done what I have promised I would do in my relationship with you. And then so I can get up the next day and I can keep my promises again. One day at a time. David is asking for this preservation, that I may daily perform my vows. In conclusion, when you find yourself far from a place of comfort and safety, remember that anywhere he is will be what you need. and there you may do what matters, daily keeping your commitments to the Lord. And that is Psalm 61.